Welcome to the deep dive. Our mission, as always, is pretty simple. We take this stack of sources, we pull out the really critical insights, and, well, we give you the knowledge you need to be genuinely well-informed.
That's the goal.
And today, we're diving into something quite fundamental. It's a flaw, really, in how we judge things. An error so common, it actually shapes our workplaces, our justice systems, even international conflict.
It's everywhere once you start looking for it.
Think about the last time, you were driving and someone just cut you off.
Oh, yeah. Happens all the time.
Right. And that instant flash of anger, that immediate judgment that the other driver is just, well, a reckless, completely self-centered person.
Absolutely. You don't think about why they did it.
Exactly. You attributed that really dangerous move directly to some kind of terrible character flaw. No hesitation. So the question is, why? Why is that our default? Why do we blame personality over the situation almost automatically?
Yeah. Why don't we think, oh, maybe they're rushing to the hospital, or maybe something unseen forced them over?
It's just not our first instinct. And this bias is really what a lot of social psychology hinges on. The fundamental attribution error, or FAE for short.
FAE. It's a big one.
Put simply, FAE is this deep tendency we have to overemphasize internal stuff. Stable traits, personality, what psychologists call disposition, while at the same time, we ignore or just minimize the external situational factors when we're judging other people.
It's that difference between seeing a bad action and immediately concluding you're seeing a bad person.
Right. It's a huge leap.
And this isn't just, some abstract theory floating around. Our deep dive today, it's really focused on giving you a precise definition, digging into the psychological gears behind it, analyzing the key research that really proved this bias is real.
Including some surprisingly modern stuff, right? Like how it even affects learning physical movements.
Exactly. We'll look at that visual motor study. And we'll explore the critical, high-stakes applications. Think about how managers see their employees, or even how superpowers saw each other during the Cold War. Big stuff. Ultimately, what we're searching for here is that fundamental insight. How do these hidden, often unconscious distortions shape our professional lives, our personal relationships, our politics? And crucially, what strategies pulled straight from these sources can actually help you counteract them?
Okay, let's do it. So let's start by sort of mapping out the territory. FAE is the main one, the cornerstone, but our sources talk about a whole family of these attribution errors. So what exactly is the fundamental attribution error? What does it look like day to day?
Okay, so the FAE is that tendency to just jump straight to internal causes. Think about a cashier being rude. Your brain's first reaction almost automatically is, wow, they are an unpleasant person.
Yeah, that sounds familiar.
It bypasses all the much more likely situational things, right? Like maybe they're underpaid, maybe they're overworked, maybe their boss just chewed them out.
We'd go there first.
No, it's a huge mental shortcut. And it focuses squarely on the person doing the action because, well, they're the most obvious thing.
And the classic examples really make it clear.
They do. Interpersonally, it's classic. Your friend cancels plans last minute. Your first thought, ugh, they're so flaky, or they're irresponsible.
Their personality.
Right, their disposition. Before you even consider legitimate external reasons like,
Right.
I don't know, their car broke down or they suddenly got sick.
Yeah.
We just prefer the simple, stable answer, that's just who they are, over the complex, maybe messy, unstable one. That's the situation they face.
Okay, so that sounds maybe inconvenient, annoying sometimes. But when does this actually become dangerous?
It gets dangerous when it gets baked into systems, institutions. Think about the legal system. When jurors are watching a defendant, they are observers. And their first instinct is often the FAE. They tend to see the defendant's alleged actions as stemming from fixed character deficits.
Like they're just a criminal type.
Exactly. They're inherently bad. Instead of giving proper weight to maybe huge external pressures, socioeconomic factors, environmental stress, duress, things that might have heavily influenced the behavior, the sources are clear. This simple bias can profoundly sway judgments about justice and blame, potentially skewing verdicts.
So that's the individual level. But you mentioned groups. When people get together, this error doesn't just stick around. It sounds like it morphs into something even worse, like weaponized bias.
That's a really good way to put it, actually.
Yeah.
When you apply the FAE across entire groups, it becomes what's called the ultimate attribution error, or UAE.
UAE, you could.
Think of it as your brain's automatic defense mechanism for your own social identity, your own group.
How does that work?
It creates this completely asymmetrical bias lens. So if someone from the out group, let's say a political rival or a competing company, whatever, if they do something negative, we immediately attribute it to their fixed inherent bad character.
That's just how those people are.
Exactly. It's
Yeah.
in their nature. But if that same outgroup member does something positive, we instantly explain it away with temporary situational factors.
Like, oh, they just got lucky that time, or someone must have forced them to do the right thing.
Precisely. It's an intellectual shield, really. It means we never have to give the other side credit for genuine good qualities, their success, a fluke, their failure, proof of their inherent flaws.
Wow. That sounds like a recipe for permanent conflict.
It absolutely fuels it. And, of course, the reverse applies to your in-group. If your own team or group messes up, oh, it's situational. The conditions were tough. The refs were biased,
Yeah, we had bad luck.
Right. But when your in-group succeeds, well, that's proof of our superior stable qualities. We're just smarter. We work harder. We're more ethical. The UAE basically ensures that group conflict gets constantly reinforced through these distorted explanations.
Okay, so FAE for individuals, UAE for in-group, out-group dynamics. Then there's the other one you mentioned, the group attribution error, GAE. Explain that one. Maybe give us a clear analogy for how that works.
Okay, the GAE, or group attribution error. This is the tendency to assume that what one individual in a group does or says somehow represents the entire group's preferences or beliefs.
So, assuming everyone in the group thinks the same way based on one person's action.
Exactly. We assume homogeneity where there's probably a lot of diversity. Researchers actually use GAE to study how we perceive groups as being sort of monolithic or extreme.
Okay, give me that analogy.
All right, imagine there's a large company, thousands of employees, and one single employee makes a really controversial, maybe extreme public statement online.
Okay.
The GAE is that immediate unconscious leap you might make. Wow, that whole company must think that way, or that's what that company stands for. You take that one single, maybe very loud data point, and you use it to define the attitude of the entire organization.
So, the danger there is creating this false image of a unified opponent, failing to see any nuance or disagreement within the other group.
Precisely. If you assume the entire opposing political party, for example, is perfectly represented by its most extreme voices, maybe because those voices are the loudest or get the most media attention, they're salient, then you shut down any possibility of finding common ground or understanding complexity. The GAE really gets in the way of nuanced social or political understanding because it makes groups seem way more uniform and often more extreme than they actually are. It's just simplification through stereotyping, but applied to whole groups of people.
It's clear these errors are just everywhere, pervasive. But let's get under the hood. Let's talk about the brain's mechanics. Why are we seemingly wired this way? Why do we prefer blaming the person over the situation? What's driving this bias?
Oh, it's important to remember we don't necessarily commit these errors because we're inherently mean or unfair. It's more that our brains are information processing machines, and they're built for efficiency, not necessarily for perfect accuracy all the time.
Right, mental shortcuts.
Exactly. Attribution errors are rooted in these cognitive biases, these heuristics that the brain uses to just cope with the overwhelming amount of information it's constantly dealing with. It's trying to save energy, basically.
And the sources pointed to two main shortcuts that really feed into the FAE.
Yeah, the first one is confirmation bias. This is huge.
Mm-hmm.
If you already have a suspicion about someone, let's say you think they're untrustworthy, you will instinctively, subconsciously filter everything they do through that lens.
You look for proof you're right.
You actively search for it. You interpret ambiguous actions negatively, and you remember the slip-ups, the times they confirmed your suspicion, much more vividly than the times they didn't. It creates this self-fulfilling loop where your belief about their disposition just gets stronger and stronger, making it almost impossible to see any situational explanations for their behavior.
Okay, confirmation bias. What's the second one?
The second is the representativeness heuristic. Our minds love patterns categories. So this heuristic involves judging a new situation or person by comparing it to a mental prototype, a category we already have stored away.
Like a mental filing cabinet.
Sort of. If a person's behavior kind of matches your existing prototype for, say, a lazy student or a shady politician, your brain goes, found a match. And it stops analyzing the specific details of the current situation. It just applies the default characteristics of that prototype to the person.
Which, when we're judging people, sounds an awful lot like stereotyping, right? You just skip the individual and slap on the group label.
That's exactly what it often leads to. You're attributing their behavior based on these generalized group traits, these stereotypes, rather than the actual complex circumstances that individuals facing right now.
Oh.
And look, these heuristics can be super useful sometimes, maybe for quickly judging if a berry is safe to eat based on past experience.
Yeah, helpful for survival.
Right. But they can be disastrous when applied to understanding complex human behavior in its social context.
Okay, so those are the internal mental shortcuts. But you also mentioned a key external factor, something about what we actually pay attention to. Perceptual salience. How does what we literally see bias our judgment?
Perceptual salience is absolutely critical here. Think about when you observe someone doing something. Who or what is the brightest object in your perceptual field?
The person doing the thing.
Exactly. The actor. They're moving, they're talking, they're visually dominant. They're the most salient feature of the scene. They capture our attention.
Okay.
But the situation, the context, that's often invisible or abstract or just spread out. Think about the oppressive humidity in the room, or the argument they just had 5 minutes before, or the large-scale economic forces shaping their choices.
You can't easily see those things.
Right. You can't easily see or quantify that complex web of external pressures. So our brain looks for the simplest, most obvious cause for the action we just witnessed.
And the person is right there, front and center.
Precisely. Because the person is perceptually more salient, more attention-grabbing than the surrounding situation, we automatically tend to assume the cause lies with them, with their disposition. Our senses basically prioritize the center of the action, and the most direct causal link available is personality. The driver cut you off. Salient action by salient actor equals bad driver. The fact that maybe the sun was directly in their eyes, or another car swerved into their lane, that's less salient, maybe even invisible to us. So we default to blaming the person.
To really grasp how stubborn this FAE is, we need to look at the classic experiments. The sources always bring up Jones and Harris, 1967, the Castro essay study. Walk us through that. What did they do and why were the findings so, well, groundbreaking?
Yeah, the Jones and Harris study is absolutely seminal. It directly tested this tension, the power of the situation versus our tendency to stick with dispositional explanations. So they had participants read essays. These essays were either strongly pro-Fidel Castro or strongly anti-Fidel Castro.
Okay, straightforward enough.
Now, the key manipulation was about choice. In one condition, the participants were told the writers had freely chosen which side to argue.
So if they wrote pro-Castro, you'd assume they were pro-Castro. Logical.
Exactly. That's the baseline. No surprise there. But here's the critical part. In the other condition, participants were explicitly, clearly, emphatically told that the writers had no choice. Their position was assigned to them, maybe by a coin flip, or as part of a debate team exercise. The situational constraint, no choice, was made absolutely clear.
Okay, so logically, if the writer was forced to write it, what they wrote shouldn't tell you anything about their personal beliefs. The situation dictated the whole thing.
That is the rational conclusion. But it's not the conclusion the participants reached. The really stunning finding was that even when the situational constraint was crystal clear, participants still inferred that the writers held genuine personal attitudes that matched the essay they wrote.
Wow. So even if they were told this person was forced to argue for Castro, they still thought, yeah, but they probably believe it a little bit.
Pretty much. They couldn't completely discount the behavior as purely situational. They couldn't stop themselves from attributing some measure of genuine belief, some dispositional alignment to the writer.
They basically invented a belief system for the writer just because they saw the words on the page.
It powerfully demonstrated how deeply ingrained the FAE is. Even when you're handed a perfect logical reason to blame the situation, they had no choice.
Yeah.
Our brains just stubbornly cling to that simpler story. Behavior reflects personality. It was the first really solid experimental evidence showing just how situationally blind we can be when judging others.
Fascinating. And the sources also brought up some really interesting developmental research. Higgins and Bryant, 1973. This suggested the bias isn't something we're born with. How do kids versus adults handle this attribution stuff?
Right. That study looked at how different age groups they tested, 4-year-olds, 9-year-olds, and adults, used something called consensus information when making judgments. Now, consensus in Kelly's attribution model basically asks, do lots of people behave this way in this situation? That's high consensus. Or only a few, low consensus.
Okay.
The theory predicts that if consensus is high, lots of people do it, we should attribute the cause to the situation or the object involved. If consensus is low, only this one person does it, We should attribute it to the person.
Makes sense. If everyone trips on that step, it's probably the step. If only one person trips, maybe they're clumsy.
Exactly.
Oh.
So Higgins and Bryant showed participants an actor making some kind of choice, and then showed whether other people made the same choice, high or low consensus. Now, the surprising part wasn't that people used consensus info. They did, across all ages. The surprise was that the influence of that consensus information was significantly weaker when people were judging their peers compared to judging non-peers.
Wait, hang on. That seems backwards. If the FAE is about ignoring the situation, why would we be more likely to ignore situational info, like consensus, when judging someone like us, like a friend or peer? Shouldn't we be more understanding?
It does seem counterintuitive, doesn't it? But the researchers proposed it's about our normative expectations. We hold stronger, more specific beliefs and expectations about how people in our own group, our peers, should behave.
Okay. Like, my friends should know better.
Kind of. When our peers deviate from that expectation, those strong internal norms seem to override the external information we're getting, like the consensus data. We might think, yeah, maybe other people struggle with this task, but my friend should have been able to handle it. Or, okay, maybe traffic was bad for everyone, but my friend should have planned better. We basically underutilize the explicit situational data because our internal standard for our own group is so high, so rigid.
Interesting. So peer pressure, but for judgment.
In a way. And the developmental shift was also really key. The 4-year-olds in the study actually showed an overall entity attribution bias. Their default was more often to blame the situation or the object. They were less prone to the FAE.
So kids start out more situationally aware.
It seems so, according to this study. But the 9-year-olds and the adults showed the classic person attribution bias, the FAE. But, and this is the crucial bit again, only when they were judging their peers. When judging non-peers, that bias wasn't really there.
So this really backs up the idea that the FAE, this tendency to blame personality, isn't innate. It's something we learn, something that gets stronger as we grow up, especially in how we judge people similar to us.
Exactly. It points strongly towards socialization and cultural learning, playing a big role in developing this bias, particularly between childhood and adolescence.
Okay, so FAE is learned, it's pervasive in social judgments, but the sources show it reaching into some really unexpected places, like deep physical and cognitive processes. Let's talk about that visuomotor rotation study. That sounded wild. How does blazing an error on an external thing affect how our body physically learns?
Yeah, that study is a fantastic illustration of how our conscious judgment of why an error occurred can impact totally implicit, subconscious physical adaptation. So motor learning, like adapting your reach when a computer cursor is rotated off target, which is what they studied, relies heavily on prediction error. When you reach and you miss where you intended, your motor system learns from that mismatch.
Makes sense. Practice makes perfect because you adjust based on errors.
Right. And this adaptation process is generally thought to involve 2 main components, learning-wise. First, there's afferent learning, which is basically proprioceptive recalibration. Think of it as the passive sensory update your body's subconscious sense of where your hand actually is in space. It's like recalibrating your internal sensors.
Okay, the passive feeling part.
Then there's the second part, efferent learning. This is about updating the predicted sensory consequences of your motor commands. It's the more active cognitive part where your brain updates its internal model of, if I send this command to my arm, this is the sensory outcome I expect. It's like updating the instruction manual.
Active prediction updating. Okay, so researchers wanted to see if telling yourself the error wasn't your fault, but the computer's fault, would stop this learning.
Basically, yes. They set up conditions where it was really obvious to the participant that the error was external. The key one was the hand view group, where participants could actually see their real hand moving normally alongside the rotated cursor on the screen. It made it impossible to deny that the cursor's movement was the source of the error.
You couldn't blame yourself if you saw your hand going straight, but the cursor's going sideways.
Exactly. And the results showed a beautiful separation. The passive, sensory, afferent recalibration, that subconscious sense of hand position that was robust. It happened anyway, regardless of whether people consciously blame the cursor or themselves. It seems too fundamental, too automatic to be easily stopped by conscious thought.
Okay, so the basic sensory update still happens, but the active part.
That was different. The updates in the efferent system, the active prediction updates, the recalibration of the motor command map, that part decreased significantly or was even eliminated when people strongly attributed the error externally, like in that hand view group.
So if you consciously decide it's not me, it's the machine, your brain actually stops trying to actively correct its motor plan for that specific weirdness.
That's what the data suggests. It implies that our high-level conscious attribution of blame is this error due to my internal skill or the external situation tool directly impacts the active predictive part of motor learning, but leaves the more fundamental passive sensory recalibration untouched. It's fascinating because it suggests there are these two distinct implicit learning processes happening, and they're affected differently by our conscious beliefs about causality.
That's incredibly deep. Okay, let's shift gears to media and persuasion. How does this FAE thing jump from judging a real person to judging, well, an actor playing a role?
This is often called the actor-character incongruence effect. It highlights just how powerful that drive for dispositional attribution is. We actually struggle subconsciously to separate the fictional character from the real actor. Viewers often misattribute the traits of the character, villain, hero, whatever, directly onto the actor's actual personality.
So if someone always plays villains, we start to think they might actually be not nice.
Yeah, there's a tendency for that bleed over. And the really critical application the sources point to is in persuasion and marketing. Think about an actor who's famous for playing villains. They have this strong negative dispositional attribution attached to them in the public mind.
Okay.
Now, what happens when that same actor appears in, say, a public service announcement for a charity or endorses a children's hospital?
The negative feeling transfers.
Exactly. That negative attribution carries over. It creates what the researchers call brand incongruence. The actor's perceived brand, villainous, clashes with the message's brand, positive, charitable. And crucially, the sources show this negative transfer actually increases the audience's tendency to counter-argue with the message.
So people actively resist the message more. They think, why is that guy telling me to donate? He's probably just doing it for the money or PR.
Precisely. The FAE, applied to the actor via their roles, reduces the effectiveness of their persuasive communication because the audience is already primed to question the actor's motives based on perceived negative character traits derived entirely from fiction.
Wild. Okay, one more specialized context. The link between blame and memory, especially in really sensitive situations, that SMEP study simulated memory error paradigm, connected assigning blame to memory getting distorted. What was that about?
Right. The SMEP research looks specifically at how the act of prompting someone to assign blame could influence how accurately they later remember details, particularly in simulated scenarios related to traumatic events like child sexual abuse, CSA. Participants were guided to attribute blame either to themselves, to another figure like the mother, to the perpetrator, or to no one in particular, the control.
And what happened to their memory?
The really striking finding was that being prompted to assign blame regardless of who was blamed, whether it was self-blame or blaming the perpetrator, predicted significantly more omission errors when they later tried to recall the details truthfully, compared to the group that didn't assign blame.
Omission errors meaning they forgot details, they left things out.
Yes, exactly. They left out details that, based on the simulation, they should have been able to recall.
So just the cognitive act of assigning blame, thinking about who was responsible, somehow messed with their ability to remember accurately. Why would that happen?
The researchers suggest it might be because blame attribution is so emotionally charged and central to how we structure the narrative of an event, especially a traumatic one. When you focus on blaming the perpetrator, or even yourself, those figures become highly central in the memory structure.
Okay.
This intense focus on blame and the central figures might interfere with retrieving other, perhaps less central but still important, factual details. It could trigger source monitoring issues, or just place such a cognitive load on the system during retrieval that other details get dropped. Essentially, the emotional and cognitive weight of assigning blame seems to disrupt the memory trace or its retrieval path, making the memory more fragmented and potentially less reliable, which has obvious, serious implications for things like investigative interviews or courtroom testimony.
The implications are definitely clear for justice, for learning, even for motor skills. But now let's scale up. Let's look at massive historical systems. Where does this seemingly small cognitive glitch impact millions? We have to start with the workplace and that historical case study, Theory X management.
Oh, absolutely. The Industrial Revolution is almost a perfect, large-scale example of the FAE shaping management philosophy and, consequently, how workers were treated. Think about early factory work. The situation imposed incredibly strong constraints.
That's so.
The jobs were highly repetitive, often dehumanizing, incredibly restrictive in terms of autonomy, and offered almost zero intrinsic motivation or potential for personal growth. In that kind of environment, how are workers likely to appear?
Bored, unmotivated, maybe resistant.
Exactly. That was the observable behavior. But the managers, looking at
He
this,
didn't blame the situation, the horrible job.
no, they committed the FAE textbook style. They ignored the overwhelming situational reality, the nature of the work itself, and attributed the workers' lack of motivation directly to a dispositional fault within the workers themselves.
So the conclusion was, workers are just naturally lazy. They inherently dislike work.
Precisely. They concluded employees are fundamentally lazy, irresponsible, lack ambition, need to be constantly supervised, coerced, threatened with punishment to get anything done.
And that set of assumptions, based on the FAE, became Theory X management.
It became codified as Theory X. It wasn't necessarily born out of pure malice, though I'm sure some existed. It was largely born out of situational blindness. Managers failed to see how the oppressive situation they had created was driving the behavior, and instead assumed the behavior reflected the worker's inherent character.
And the shift away from that only happened when the situation changed.
Largely, yes. Later, management theories started to shift. Thinkers like McGregor proposed Theory Y, which suggested that if you enrich the situation, offer meaningful work, autonomy, responsibility, chances for growth, then employees will be motivated and engaged. When work situations actually started to become more enriched, allowing for individual potential to actually show, Theory Y gained traction. But the FAE fundamentally dictated the dominant management approach for a huge chunk of the 20th century.
Okay, from the factory floor to the highest stakes imaginable, geopolitics. The sources claim the FAE was a central feature of the Cold War, particularly the nuclear relationship. How did this attribution error ratchet up tensions between the U.S. and the Soviet Union?
Yeah, analyses of the Cold War definitely point to the FAE as a dangerous cognitive contaminant in that relationship. It seems both sides were prone to it. But the sources often highlight the American perception of the Soviet Union as a key example.
How so?
U.S. policymakers and analysts tended to heavily emphasize the Soviet state's internal dispositional characteristics. Things like its core revolutionary Marxist-Leninist ideology, or the presumed inherent aggressiveness of its leaders, their perceived willingness to use nuclear weapons to achieve global domination.
So the view was that Soviet behavior stemmed from this unchangeable, inherently hostile core identity. They were just fundamentally aggressive regardless of what the U.S. did.
That was often the underlying assumption, yes. And this focus on Soviet disposition came at the direct expense of underestimating or even ignoring powerful situational factors, the most obvious one being the action-reaction cycle inherent in any arms race.
Give me an example.
Okay, say the U.S. develops and deploys a new, more advanced missile system. The Soviet Union responds, predictably, by building up its own arsenal to counter it. From a perspective clouded by the FAE, that Soviet buildup isn't seen as a logical situational reaction to a perceived security threat posed by the new U.S. weapon.
Instead, it's seen as
just more evidence of their inherent dispositional aggressiveness. See, they're always looking for an excuse to build more weapons. This kind of thinking, this situational blindness, prevented policymakers from recognizing potentially valid security concerns on the other side, or seeing opportunities where changing the situation, like through arms control agreements, might actually alter behavior.
So the FAE basically locks you into seeing the adversary as inherently evil, making de-escalation almost impossible because you don't believe their actions or responses, only reflections of their bad character.
It creates a dangerous, self-fulfilling prophecy. If you only attribute your enemy's actions to their unchanging evil nature, you miss or dismiss chances for diplomacy or de-escalation that might arise from shifts in the situation. The conflict becomes anchored in perceived disposition, making it seem intractable and perpetually hostile.
This leads us perfectly to what Lee Ross, the psychologist who really pushed FAE research, later called the truly fundamental attribution error, something even bigger.
That's right. He later argued that perhaps the most fundamental error of all is naive realism.
Naive realism, what is that?
It's the deep, often completely unconscious conviction that my own way of seeing the world, my perceptions, my beliefs, my values, is realistic, objective, and unbiased. And the crucial corollary to that is, therefore, any reasonable, rational, objective person must and should see the world the same way I do.
Wow. Okay, so it's the belief that I see things as they really are.
Exactly. It creates what Ross termed the illusion of objectivity. And if you truly believe you have this perfectly clear, unbiased view of reality, What's the logical conclusion you draw about someone who disagrees with you fundamentally?
That they must be the ones who are wrong,
Mhm.
or biased, or irrational.
Or worse, they're not just mistaken, they must be unreasonable, maybe driven by ideology or self-interest. Perhaps they're even suffering from some kind of intellectual or character defect. This is the essence of the bias blind spot. We're pretty good at spotting bias in others, but we have a remarkably hard time recognizing it in ourselves because we're convinced of our own objectivity.
And in any kind of conflict, that illusion must be absolutely catastrophic. It just eliminates the possibility of finding common ground based on different, but maybe equally valid perspectives.
It's devastating. It leads directly to phenomena like reactive devaluation. This is a fascinating and dangerous effect. Imagine you're in a tense negotiation, say between two warring factions. The other side puts forward a proposal, maybe involving mutual concessions.
Okay.
A naive realist, convinced of their own objective view of the situation and the opponent's inherent bad faith, will instinctively devalue that proposal,
Not because of what's in the proposal.
but simply because the adversary was the one who proposed it. The source taints the message. The thinking goes, if they proposed it, it must be a trick, it must benefit them unfairly, even if it looks reasonable on the surface. The content becomes almost secondary to the assumed malicious intent of the proposer.
That's a huge barrier.
It's a massive psychological barrier to resolving conflict. Each side, locked in their own naive realism, attributes the other side's position not to different histories, values, or interpretations of facts, but to stubbornness, irrationality, character flaws, and a deliberate distortion of reality. It keeps the conflict stuck in this emotional dispositional mud.
Okay, so we see the FAE is powerful, learned, and has these huge implications. But you mentioned it's not universal. That implies culture and maybe development play a huge role in how strong this bias is. Let's unpack that. Where does culture fit in?
Culture is absolutely fundamental in shaping attributional styles. The sources consistently highlight this big contrast, often drawn between generally individualistic cultures and generally collectivist cultures.
Like the US versus, say, many East Asian cultures.
Broadly speaking, yes. In highly individualistic cultures like the US, Western Europe, there's a strong emphasis on personal autonomy, individual achievement, taking personal responsibility for your successes and failures. This cultural framework naturally reinforces the FAE. If you believe you are the master of your own destiny, then outcomes are logically seen as reflecting your internal qualities, your disposition.
Makes sense. Your success is yours. Your failure is yours.
Right. Conversely, in more collectivist cultures, which might prioritize social harmony, group independence, fulfilling social roles, fitting in, there's generally more emphasis placed on the context, the situation, the relationships, the external factors. People in these cultures may be more likely to see behavior as shaped by social roles, obligations, or the specific situation, which inherently reduces the tendency to jump straight to dispositional explanations. It dials down the FAE.
And the research backs this up, that it's not universal, especially when you look at complex societies. Tell us about that study in India with the different caste groups.
Yeah, that study done in Delhi with university students was really illuminating. They looked at intergroup attributions between students from the general caste, historically the more dominant group, and students from scheduled castes, historically subordinate and facing discrimination. They were testing the ultimate attribution error, UAE.
Remind us, UAE is blaming out-group failures on character and in-group failures on situation.
Exactly, and vice versa for successes. It predicts that the dominant group should always favor itself and blame the subordinate group's failures on internal flaws.
But that's not what they found in Delhi.
No, the findings really challenged the universality of the classic UAE model, which was largely developed in Western contexts. First, the general caste participants of the dominant group showed no significant intergroup attribution bias. They didn't automatically default to blaming SC failures on character flaws more than their own group's failures.
Wow, that's a major departure.
It is. And perhaps even more striking was the finding for the scheduled caste participants, the subordinate group. They actually showed a pattern of in-group derogation.
Meaning they blamed their own group more.
They tended to attribute the failures of their own group, the scheduled caste, to causes that were less external and more stable, closer to internal dispositional factors compared to how they explain the dominant group's failures.
That completely flips the UAE script.
It does. It strongly suggests that the specific power dynamics, the social hierarchy, the dominant ideologies within a particular culture can profoundly alter how these attribution biases manifest. The UAE isn't some fixed, universal psychological law that applies the same way everywhere. It's highly dependent on the social context, history, and ideology.
Okay, so culture shapes it. And we also confirmed earlier that this tendency seems to be acquired, not innate, really kicking in between ages 8 and 15. If it's learned, maybe we can unlearn it or at least manage it. What practical strategies do the sources offer for trying to keep this FAE in check?
Well, the first step may be obvious, but absolutely crucial is just awareness and education. You have to know the error exists in the first place.
Know thy bias.
Exactly. Things like self-awareness training, practicing mindfulness, engaging in reflective practices, whether personally or in professional training, these can help individuals start to notice and maybe interrupt those automatic leaps to dispositional judgment. Just recognizing the pattern is huge.
Okay, awareness first. What's next?
The next level involves actively cultivating critical thinking and empathy. We really have to push ourselves and encourage others to engage in perspective taking.
Trying to see it from the other person's shoes?
Yes, and one really powerful concrete strategy the sources mention, especially useful in mediation or conflict resolution, is structured perspective taking. You actually ask one person in the dialogue to state the other side's position, including their reasoning, their historical context, the situational factors they emphasize so accurately and fairly that the other side genuinely agrees, yes, you understand my perspective.
Wow, that sounds hard, but powerful. It forces you to truly engage with the situational factors you might normally ignore.
It's the cognitive antidote to the FAE in that moment. It compels you to integrate that external context, shifting the focus away from just attacking character and towards understanding the whole picture, which is essential for real problem solving.
Okay, awareness, empathy through perspective taking. What about bigger systems like organizations or schools?
We can definitely implement changes there. For organizations, training managers specifically to look for and evaluate situational factors before jumping to conclusions about an employee's performance is key. This helps prevent those unfair evaluations rooted in that old theory X thinking, blaming the person, instead of maybe poor training, bad tools, or an impossible workload.
And in education.
In schools, it's about actively teaching students more accurate and adaptive attributional styles. For instance, encouraging them to attribute academic setbacks, not to a fixed lack of ability, I'm just dumb, which is a dispositional attribution, but to factors they can control, like effort, I didn't study hard enough for that test, or strategy, I need to try a different approach next time, which are more situational or controllable. It's essentially teaching them to analyze failures in a way that promotes future effort and learning, rather than helpless resignation based on perceived character flaws.
So we've covered a lot of ground today. We went from that split-second judgment in traffic, that road rage moment,
Yeah, the everyday FAE.
all the way to the complex architecture of social hierarchies, Theory X, the Cold War, even how our brains perceive actors. It's clear the fundamental attribution error, and its even more fundamental cousin, naive realism, aren't just quirky concepts for psychologists. They are active forces shaping our reality, constantly nudging us away from complex situations and towards simplistic, often deeply unfair judgments about people's character.
Absolutely. And the real value, I think, of this deep dive isn't just knowing the terms. It's gaining that immediate power, that tool, to just pause that initial automatic judgment.
That moment of hesitation.
Exactly. Understanding these biases is the essential first step towards finding a fairer, more accurate balance between appreciating someone's individual character and acknowledging the often immense power of the situations they find themselves in.
It's about seeing both the actor and the stage.
Beautifully put. And as we wrap up, maybe reflect on something the philosopher Isaiah Berlin observed. He noted that few things in history have caused more harm, more suffering, than the fervent belief by individuals or groups that they are in sole possession of the truth.
That connects directly back to naive realism.
It does. And Lee Ross, the social psychologist we discussed, made this wonderful analogy connecting that feeling of absolute certainty, that illusion of objectivity, to a simple physical phenomenon. Think about looking at a straight stick partially submerged in water.
It looks bent, right, because of refraction.
Exactly. It looks bent. Intellectually, that the stick is straight, but you cannot not see it as bent. Your direct perception is powerfully convincing, even when you know it's an illusion.
So the bent stick is like our perception of someone else's behavior or motives distorted by our own internal water, our biases, our naive realism.
Precisely. You now have the intellectual knowledge from this deep dive that your perception of others is likely being distorted, just like the stick in the water. But you can't just will yourself to see it accurately. You can't easily unsee the bent stick. So the final challenge, the question to leave you with is this. Knowing this, Knowing your own perception might be flawed, even when it feels perfectly clear and objective. How do you build systems? How do you structure things in your personal relationships, in your teams at work, and how you engage in public discourse that force you to act, not just on the powerful conviction of your immediate perception, but on the knowledge that your view might be distorted? How do you, in essence, institutionalize a healthy skepticism towards your own certainty?